Okay, so today we just want to take a look at some real basic introductions to Maya so that you guys can start to get comfortable just kind of working through the program and just getting a basic understanding of what some of the menus are, how to create simple polygons, how to rename them, and kind of how to move them around the screen. So when you open up Maya, this is what you'll see, and this is your basic interface right here. So it may look a little bit different depending on what layer you're in or what kind of setting you're in. So I'm in modeling right now, but if I click this drop down up on the top left, you'll see that there's a bunch of other options as well. We're just going to stick to modeling for this tutorial and for this series because that's what we're going to be focusing on. Over in the top right, there's a couple of different workspaces you can choose from as well. I'm going to be using just the basic Maya Classic. It should probably load automatically for you, but feel free to play around with those and get comfortable with whatever one you like the best. So right in the middle, you can see that this is our camera and this is our perspective view, as you can see on the bottom. So the perspective view is one viewport that we can use, and if you actually just have your cursor in that perspective view and you click Spacebar, it'll split your screen into 4 views. So now we have some other orthographic options. Our perspective view is going to be up on the top right. On the top left, we have our top view. On the bottom left, we have our front view. And our bottom right, we have our side view. So those are what would be referred to as your orthographic views, your top, your front, and your side. And we'll use them quite a bit throughout the entire series, but they'll be useful when it comes to modeling. So I'm then going to put my cursor back in the perspective view and just click Spacebar again, and it should blow that one right back up for you. Alright, so over on the left, you can see that we have our select tool, which is this top one. Right under that we have a lasso tool, a paint selection tool, a move tool, a rotate tool, and a scale tool. So those are going to be our basic 6 settings that are going to be loaded over on the left hand side of the screen for us. And we're going to be looking at some of those today. Right up on top, this is a newer feature in Maya. It's got this kind of toolbar, and you can click into some different options. Mine auto loads at polygons. So if yours is not at polygons, just click on polygons so that you have this same toolbar here that I have. And in here, you'll see over on the left, you have a polygon sphere, a polygon cube, a polygon cylinder, a cone, a plane, and then some other options as well. And there's going to be a bunch of other things that we'll kind of touch on throughout the entire series, but we're not going to look at everything that's on there today. We're really just going to look at these first few. Okay, so on the right side of your screen, this is what's going to be called your channel box or your attribute editor. So there's going to be 2 different options here. And when we actually start creating polygons and you click on them, the channel box and the attribute editor is where you'll kind of adjust settings on your objects. So you can give them a different look or kind of change what's going on as far as your polygon goes. And then down on the bottom right, this is going to be your display layers. So right now it should be set at display layers. Over to the right, these are your animation layers. We are not going to look at that at all in this series. We're just going to stick with display layers. So we'll use them quickly later on, but what they pretty much do is, if you've ever used Photoshop or anything else where you can create layers, it's the same idea. So if I create a couple of different polygons, if I create a sphere and a cube and I want to throw them in different layers so that I can easily select each one, I can just select the object when I have it in my perspective view, and I can add it to a new layer, rename that layer, and then go from there. So that's helpful. And down on the bottom, you'll kind of see this timeline. So on this timeline, right now we have 1 through 120. Those are what's known as keyframes. So this would be 120 frames that you can adjust if we were to actually be doing animation. And you can manipulate that as well down here so that it's bigger or smaller. We're not really going to look at that too much in this series, but we'll touch on it later on. Underneath that, you have a time slider, so you can click on where it says 120. Pull this in to shrink your timeline, or pull it out to maximize your timeline. So I'm just going to leave it where it was at 120. It's not a big deal. Over on the right, you just have your normal play settings. So like any other video program that's out there, you have play and you have forward one key and step back and all of those other things. So, you'll mess with that when you start using animation a little bit more. And then the only other thing down here that I want to look at is over on the far right. So way down on the far right, you've got this little orange guy running with this little kind of wheel looking behind him. And if we click on that, that is going to be our animation preferences. So the animation preferences, we'll use probably quite a bit. We'll be in and out of it to change some settings. In here, there's just a ton of different settings that will adjust what's going on in Maya. It does say animation preferences, so most of these do have to relate to animation. So when we start using animation, we'll use these a little bit more. But we'll be in and out of it a couple of times throughout the series, just so that you guys can start to become familiar with it. So the only one that I'm going to adjust right now is mine auto loads at time slider, but right underneath it, it says undo. So I'm going to click that undo button, and it's going to load a couple of different settings for me over here. And this is completely optional to you. So I want my undo to be on, obviously. And then for my Q, I'm going to change that to be infinite. And what that's going to do is it's going to let us undo as many times as we could ever need to undo. And if you change that at the beginning, it should save it. And it might save you later on, because what might happen is you're modeling something goes terribly wrong. You really need to undo to figure out what happened. And if you had it set at the preset, you're only going to be able to go back 50 times. And that might seem like a lot, but when you've made a ton of little adjustments in Maya, 50 is not going to be that many. So if you change it to infinite, it's going to have more storage in your Maya file. But I'm willing to deal with that if it means I can undo and kind of fix any mistakes that we might have throughout the process. Then I'm just going to go down and click Save and go back into my perspective view. So we've talked about a couple of these. Up on the top, we have some other settings. So we have File, Edit, Create, Select, Modify, and a bunch of other ones that are in here. We will be touching on most of these throughout the series, but I'm not going to talk about all of them today, but I just want you to become familiar with them. So the one that we're going to look at a little bit right now is just File. So in File, you have some of the same basic settings that you would have in any other program that you guys have been using throughout your life. So you have a new scene. So a Maya is going to call its files a scene, just like Microsoft Word would call it a document. Maya saves scenes, and there's two different types of scenes. There's an MA or an MB, and we're not really going to talk about the difference between the two of them. Either one should work fine for you. So whatever your Maya is preset as, just feel free to leave it at that, and we'll talk about that in a second. But in here, you can create a new scene, you can open up a scene, you can save your scenes, and there's just a bunch of other options. You can import, you can export. But the one thing that makes Maya a little bit different than some other programs is that down on the bottom, it says Project, and under that it says Project Window. And I want to click that Project Window button first. And what that's going to do is it's going to load up this project window. So Maya will actually create a project for all of your scenes. And what it will do is inside of that project, it's going to have all of these different folders that it's going to create. And it's going to have things like your scenes, which is where it's going to save your actual files. Then it's going to have templates and images and source images where you can put textures that you might be using, and all of these other folders that Maya is going to automatically create for you so that everything can stay nice and organized. And then when it needs information, it's going to save things in certain folders and pull from those folders so that everything can kind of stay together. So I'm just going to go to the top and I'm going to click New, so that what you'll see now is it says New Project, okay? So I'm going to just highlight that, and I'm just going to type in my last name, so Bauer, and I'm just going to put modeling intro, and I'll leave it at that. All right, and then right underneath it, you have your location. So if I go over to the right, I can click this folder, and I can save that to go wherever I want. I'm just going to put it on my desktop, click Select, and then just click Accept. I'll leave everything else as it is. So now if I were to go open that up, you can see on my folder I have modeling intro, or Bauer modeling intro, and I'm just going to blow that up. So in here, if I make it a list, you can see the different items that we have. So we have our assets, our autosave, all of these other folders. Inside scenes is where it'll actually save our scenes that we create. If I go back, and then some other ones as well that we'll talk about throughout the lesson, but we're not going to look at right now. All right, so I'm going to go back into my Maya, and I want to save my first scene. So then I'm going to go up to File, and I'm going to go to Save Scene As, and you'll notice it's automatically going to place it in that Scenes folder. So I'm going to save mine on my desktop, my Bower Modeling Intro. It's automatically going to my Scenes folder, and I'm just going to call this Bower Modeling Intro 01. So I have mine as an MB file. That's just what my Maya was preset at, which I'm just going to use. If yours is an MA, it's really not going to make a difference. So use whatever you want or whatever your Maya is automatically set at. And then just click Save As. All right, so now we are actually working in our first scene, which is good. That will help keep things organized. It'll help us in case Maya crashes, which it likes to do. So we want to avoid that, and we want to save as frequently as possible. So I would recommend you guys saving quite often throughout your projects when you're working on different models and that sort of thing. Save frequently, and don't just save, but save up. So what that means is after you've been working for, say, an hour, or after you get something important done that you don't want to lose, rather than just saving so that you can't go back, you should go to File, Save Scene As, and just save this as Bower Modeling Intro 2. Save that, and then we're working in that second file. And that'll help you guys out. That'll save you some time. And it'll always give you kind of that step back. In case something goes wrong, you can step back to your previous file. You won't lose a ton of work. And then you can kind of take off from there again. So the next thing that I want to do is create our first polygon. So I'm just going to go up to Polygons, and in my little toolbar here, over on the left, you can see that it says Polygon Sphere. All right, so there's a couple of different ways to create a polygon. I can easily just click this Polygon Sphere, and what you'll notice is it loaded a sphere in the center of my perspective view. So I'm going to delete that. Another way I can do it is to go to Create, and then down to Polygon Primitives, and then Sphere. All right, the other thing you want to look at is if your interactive creation is on or off. I like keeping mine off, then it's going to automatically place the sphere. If you have it on, it just means that you have to adjust the size of the sphere from the beginning. It's not a big deal either way. It's just easier for me to kind of keep it off. So I could click Sphere here. It's going to load that same sphere. So that's two different ways that you can adjust this. And your third way, if I delete that, is to hold down Spacebar. And Spacebar is going to give you this huge menu. And what it actually is all of these other menus that you've seen throughout your interface, just kind of in this one view. And it's really helpful because wherever I click Spacebar, it's going to put that menu for me right in my viewport. So I use that quite a bit. And in here, you'll see the File, Edit, Create, Select, Modify, just like what we have up on top. And if I were to click Create and go down to Polygon Primitives, I could create my sphere again. So now we have that sphere created in the center of our grid, and that's what this is right here. So this is our grid, and it's going to place that sphere right on 0. So our translate X, Y, and Z values are all at 0. And the translate values are really just where the item is moved throughout your scene. So if I click off, click anywhere else in your viewport, you'll see that you lose kind of the green highlight that was once on my sphere. And to get it back, I just need to click my sphere again, and then it'll load it. All of that wireframe, all the geometry that's going around, you can see is back. Rather than making sure that you're selecting the exact thing every time, the other option for you is to just click and drag and draw a box over your screen, and anything inside of that box will be selected. So you need to be a little careful with that. Kind of later on when you're working on more in-depth models that you're only selecting what you want to select. But for something like this, when we only have the one object on the screen, rather than me just trying to click it, I can just draw a box over my viewport. It'll select my sphere, and then we can start working with it from here. So up in the top right, you can see now in my channel box that we have some settings. So it's loaded my P sphere 1, which is what Maya has kind of just named my sphere, and that's what Maya will call it. But if I want to change the name of it, if I want to name it something of my own, I can just click where it says P sphere 1, and it'll highlight it, and I can rename it whatever I want. So if I just call it ball 01 and click enter, it'll then rename my polygon for me. Underneath that, we have our translate X values, our Y, our Z, and then our rotate X, Y, Z, and our scale X, Y, Z. And then right under that, we have our visibility. I'm going to leave the visibility alone, and we'll talk about some of these other ones, okay? So the first one that I want to talk about is my translate. So my translate X, Y, and Z is really just a move tool. And I'm going to call it a move tool quite a bit because I'm just used to saying that. So if I click any of those, translate X, Y, or Z, you can see now that we have this new handle or manipulator that's showing up inside of our viewport, okay? And it's got a couple different arrows on it and some buttons that we can press. Another way to get this is with your item selected. So if I just select my ball and I click W, W is going to be your hotkey for your translate or for your move. And now if I select any of these arrows, you'll see that they highlight themselves yellow, and then I can move my ball throughout my scene just by kind of moving my mouse. So this is my translate Z value, and you can see how the translate Z numbers are changing as I move my ball. So if I just click Z, it'll undo. So Z is your undo button, just like anything else. If I click any of the other arrows, you'll see I can go on my X axes here, and then the green one up top is going to be my Y. Your Y is going to be your up and down or your vertical. Okay? So if I adjust these a little bit and I want to get things back to 0, I could either try and slowly adjust each one back, or in my channel box, which is really nice, is I can just select all 3 of these. So click and drag over X, Y, and Z, type 0 on your keyboard, and click enter, and you'll notice that it'll just plop your sphere back at 0 right in the center of our grid so that we can look at some of these other options. All right, so the next one is going to be our rotate. So our rotate value, we have X, Y, and Z as well. And that's because we can rotate this item the same way that we can move it throughout the screen. So rotate, if I click any of these, you'll see this new handle, and it's kind of this sphere almost. It's around our sphere that we can then click on some of these little axes here, and they'll highlight themselves yellow. And that's the same idea as the translate. The other way to get to that, the hotkey, is to select your object and click E. So E is your rotate, W is your translate or your move. And then if I just select some of these and I rotate this around, you can see my ball now rotating in the viewport. Okay. So I put it back to 0. And then the last one I want to talk about is your scale. So your scale is going to show and give a new handle that looks a little bit different than the translate and the rotate. So if I click any of these, it'll load that handle up. And the hotkey for that is going to be R. So on your keyboard, just click W is going to be your move tool, E is going to be your rotate tool, and R is going to be your scale. So with R selected, I can then go over to any of these handles here, and I can click and drag, and then I can scale my sphere throughout my view here. And then if you click the one in the center for scale, it'll scale all 3 of them the same. So if you need to keep things even, if you just want to blow the sphere up all at once, you can click the center part, and you'll notice in my channel box that the X, Y, and Z values are all remaining consistent. So I'm going to just put my sphere back at 0 and click enter. Oh, sorry. It should actually be 1. So you want your scale to be 1. 1 is the preset for your scale. Okay, so right now you're probably thinking, all right, that's great. We can move things around. We can rotate them. We can scale them. But the one thing that we haven't really looked at is how to actually move around our screen. And what if I want to zoom in on my sphere? Or what if I want to adjust where my camera is so that I can get a better angle on something? So in order to do that, there's a couple of simple buttons. So the first one I'm going to talk about is just by clicking F. And F is going to focus. It's kind of your hotkey for focus. So if I click F, it's going to zoom me in to whatever object I have selected. Okay? And that's what just happened. So I clicked F, it pulled me right in, and then you can see the little handles right inside of my sphere. I can adjust any of those settings now, which is really nice. So now let's say I'm in and I want to actually zoom out a little bit. On your mouse, you can just use the wheel or the scroll or whatever you want to call it, and just kind of zoom in and out with your scroll wheel. So that's a quick way to kind of zoom way out or zoom way in. But if you are way out, like I said, and you rather than scrolling all the way in, if you have your item selected, you can just click F and it'll pull you right back in to your object. Okay, so that's how you can get around there. So the next thing I want to talk about, and I'm using a Mac, so things are going to be a little bit different if you're on a Windows computer, but the buttons are all pretty consistent. So I forget exactly which one it is on the Windows, but it's going to be right to the left of your space bar is all the buttons that you're going to need. So I'm just going to be talking off of a Mac. So if I click Command or Apple, and then I hold my middle mouse button down, you'll see that I can then move my camera around. But I'm not really adjusting my angle. I'm not going to rotate around my sphere. So I can just move things that way. So that's really helpful. And then the other way you can kind of move around, if you just want to rotate your camera, is by clicking that command button again. And rather than using the middle mouse button, you're going to use your left click. So then left click, and you'll see that you can rotate your camera 360 degrees, however you want to rotate it, all throughout your viewport or in your perspective view. So that's really helpful. So now with those 3 options, you really have max freedom to move your camera anywhere that you want it, just by zooming in or out with your wheel, holding command and clicking that middle mouse button to kind of pan around your screen, or holding down command and clicking the left mouse to rotate your camera. Okay, perfect. So we've talked about a few things. We've looked at creating a sphere, which is just creating a polygon. We've talked about a couple of different menus. We've talked about how to just easily rotate your camera around your screen. We've talked about renaming your polygon. So those are all good things. So the next thing that I want to do is look at a couple of different polygons, and then also just talking about how to manipulate them in a very basic sense, as far as just adjusting some basic features on a sphere or on a cube or a cylinder or anything that you might be modeling with. So before I do that, I'm going to throw this sphere into its own layer. Okay, so I need to have it selected, and then I'm going to go down to the bottom right where I was in my display layers that we looked at really quickly earlier. So over on the right side of the screen in my display layer box, there's 4 different options, okay? So if I were to have some layers selected or already created, this first button is going to move this selection up in the list, so it'll just kind of move my layer up and down the list. The next one will move it down the list. The next option is going to create a new layer, so that's helpful if you just want to create a new layer. But the one that I'm going to use is that last option, the 4th one. It's kind of this this grid or this plane with this blue ball on top, and that is create a new layer and assign selected objects. So if you're not sure what a button's going to do, in the bottom left-hand side of your screen, anytime you hover over any setting or any button in Maya, it's going to tell you exactly what it's going to do. So I can't move my mouse down to show you guys that because I would lose that. But if you look down to the bottom left-hand side of my screen right now, you can see where it says create a new layer and assign selected objects. If I were to go over one, it just says create a new layer. So you can see the difference between the two, and it just depends on which button in Maya I'm hovering over. So I'm going to select the create a new layer and assign selected objects. And you'll notice right here that I now have layer 1, and it's got a couple of different buttons here. So let's say I want to rename it and I want to make this my ball. So if I double click on layer 1, I can edit the layer. Okay, so I'm just going to rename this ball LYR, and my LYR is going to stand for layer because I want to name everything differently in Maya. And then I'm just going to save. Oh, and I pulled my view out real quick, so that's okay. All right, so I'll just leave it over on the side. So I have that here, and the one thing you'll notice is over on the left-hand side of my layer, there's that V, and that's your visibility. So if I click the V on and off, it's going to turn my ball on and off in a sense that we can see it or we can't see it. So that'll help if you need to turn something off or if you want to see it or you don't want to see it. Okay, so I'm actually going to just turn my ball off right now. And I want to create a new polygon. So the next one I'm going to create is a cube. So if I go up to my little toolbox here, the next one in is my Polygon Cube, and I'm just going to select that. So here, if I click F, I can zoom in, we have a Polygon Cube. And I'm going to rename it, so I'm going to go up into my channel box here. Sorry, my Maya got a little messed up. And I'm just going to select where it says pCube1 and call this just Cube01. So the other thing that you can do with really any object that you have is you can adjust the amount of edges that are going to be on your polygon. So with my cube selected, if I look down in my channel box to where it says inputs and then polycube1 and select that, you can see in here where I have subdivisions. So I have my width, my height, and my depth all for subdivisions. And what's going to happen is if I change any of those, so if I highlight them and just type in 4, it's going to add in new subdivisions onto my geometry so that I have more freedom and flexibility as far as manipulating it, as far as pulling things in and out and kind of changing the shape that I'm going to be working with. So we're going to use that. So I'm going to leave it at 4 right now, and I'm going to create a new layer with that object. So that in my display layers is the button over on the far right. I'm then just going to double click and rename it Cube LYR. All right, and the only reason we did that is because I wanted you guys to create a few layers so that you're familiar with it, because it is a great way to organize your data once you're inside of Maya, because when you're working in bigger scenes, if you actually start working on projects, or on different films and you have 100 different models, it's nice to keep them organized. So using your display layers will only help you with that. So we have the cube, and we're just going to work off of the cube for right now and kind of talk about how we can now manipulate this object to make it look a little bit differently than just a cube. And the stuff that we'll talk about with the cube would relate to any other polygon that's out there as well. So whether you have a ball or a sphere created, or a cylinder or a cone, or any of these other polygons that are kind of pre-made for you, these next buttons are going to work the same for any of them. So we're just going to work on a cube, but just know that you can use them across the board. So with my cube selected, if I right click, oh, there we go. You'll notice that you now have some new settings. And that is how Maya is going to work. So Maya is always just going to have new buttons that are going to pop up whenever you click different things. And here we have kind of this new list that wraps around, and currently we are in object mode. So object mode is really if you're clicked off of your object and then you just click it, and you can move it around and do whatever you want with the entire object. That is when you're in object mode. So that's kind of your preset, your standard mode that you'll work in a lot. So if I right click and I go back in here, we're just going to talk about a few of the other ones that are inside of this list. So the one on top is edge. So if I move my cursor over and I highlight edge and I let go, it'll then put us into edge mode. And in edge mode, we can, like it says, select any of these edges. So anything that's highlighted red is an edge. And you can see that it's really in between any of the subdivisions that are taking place on our cube. So if I select one of these, you'll then notice that my little display handle, my little translate tool, is going to load up for that edge. And I can then pull out that edge or push in that edge or move that edge around wherever I want it to go. Just like what we were doing with the entire object earlier when we were messing around with our sphere, okay? So if I were to pull this out, you'll notice if I click E, I can rotate it, and rotating an edge isn't really going to do anything, but just know that you have the capability to do it. So I guess it will mess with it a little bit depending on which value you rotate. All right, and then you can also click R and you can scale your edge up or down to just, change the shape of your cube. So I'm going to go back. And that is our edge tool. So the one nice thing and the one thing I wanted to talk about quickly with your edge tool is how to select multiple edges at once. So let's say you wanted to select from here, this top one in the middle, to this one down here. Okay, so if you hold down Shift, you can then select multiple edges at once, and you can move them all together, which is nice. But the one quicker way to do this, if I select my first edge and I go to the last one, assuming they're in the same edge loop or the same line, and I hold down Shift and then I just double click, it will select all of the edges that are kind of in between. And that can be helpful because when you have bigger items and when you have more data on your items, more edges, more polygons going on, more geometry, being able to select them rather than one at a time is gonna help you out. Okay, so then I'm gonna right click and I'm gonna go over to vertex and go into this mode here. So all of a sudden you'll see on our sphere all of these pink dots that take place where any of our edges kind of intersect with one another. And what those are vertices. So all of your polygons are going to be made up of vertices, and really every edge or every intersection is going to have a vertices to it, or a vertex, whatever you want to call it. So what you can do with them is adjust them the same way we've adjusted the entire object, or we just adjusted an edge. So you can't really scale the vertice, it's not going to do anything, but you can rotate it. Rotate's not really going to do much either, but you can just move it. So mostly if you're going to be using your vertice tool, you're just going to be moving things around. So if I select one, and you'll notice that they kind of bold up before you select them so you can see which one you're hovering on and which one you will select. So if I click any of them, I can then move my selection handle. If I click W, get my selection, my move tool up, I can move the vertice around so that we can, again, just change the way that our object looks. Okay. So that's another thing that you're able to do to really change the way that your cube or whatever your polygon is that you're working with looks. So the one time that you would potentially use your scale tool with vertices is if you select more than one vertice at a time. So that goes with rotate as well. If you just have one selected, you're never really going to have a reason to rotate it or scale it. But if you select more than one, then all of a sudden it opens up those other options for you. So I'm going to click Spacebar, and I'm going to zoom in on my front view. And in your other views, in your top, your front, or your side, your what are called your orthographic views, you're never going to be able to rotate in them or anything like that. They're set where they are, and they're going to be looking directly at your object as far as whether it's the front, the top, or the side. There's a bottom view and some other ones we can look at later on. We're not going to get to those today. So if I just go into my front view and I click Spacebar, I'm going to blow that up. So now we're looking at a different side of our cube than what we had just manipulated, okay? So over on the left here, if I drag a box over that entire left side, you'll notice that I'm going to select all of those vertices over on the left, okay? So then if I were to click R, I can scale those up or down, and I can then move things and kind of adjust the way that our vertices look. And then I can manipulate more than one at a time. So if I wanted to keep things somewhat symmetrical on my object, I could then select the other side as well. And now if I scale things down and then pull them in, you'll see that both sides are going to be working together. So it's just a nice way to quickly change the shape of your object with both sides. There's other ways to model one side and then mirror your entire polygon over to the other. But if you're just looking to kind of work at both sides at once, that's a nice way to manipulate multiple vertices without having to do both sides, because that's just going to kill time. Okay. And the other thing you can obviously do is rotate. So if I go into my rotate, I can rotate my vertices around, just like we've looked at with anything else. All right, so I'm going to click Spacebar. I'm going to go back into my perspective view and click Spacebar again. You'll notice that all of those vertices we were working with are highlighted in yellow. That was everything that we had selected. So if I click off of any of it, it will then deselect. So the last manipulator I want to look at is going to be a face. So if I right click and I go down to the bottom, you can see where it says face. And what this is going to do is it's going to let us adjust any particular face on our cube or our sphere or whatever our polygon is that we have selected. So every single one of these kind of separate polygons that's within our cube is a face. So anytime I have those vertices that are kind of surrounding it, so all of these that we see right now would be considered quads. And they're considered quads because when we were in our vertex mode, they all had 4 sides, right? They have 4 vertices, they have 4 edges, and if that's the case, they're considered a quad. And each quad on our cube is going to be a separate face. And what we can do with that face is move it around or rotate it or scale it the same way we can use it on any of the other options with the cube. So if I move it around, I have the same buttons here. If I click R, I can scale it. And if I click E, I can rotate it. Okay, so you have a lot of freedom and flexibility as far as your face tool goes, because you're able to really change the look of something quickly. And just like with anything else, you can select more than one at a time. If you hold down Shift, you can select an entire side. You can select multiple or random ones, whatever you prefer. Like we looked at with our Edge tool, if you need to select this top row, if you click your first one and go to the other side, hold down Shift and double click, it'll select the path across. And you can kind of quickly select an entire side that way, which is nice. So if I have my whole side selected, I can scale or move these out, then I can scale them up, and then I can rotate this down to model whatever this shape is that we've decided to create here. All right. So those are some very basic settings as far as Maya goes. And all that I really wanted to look at in this first tutorial for this series was just how to kind of work your way through your interface, how to load Maya, how to save a file, how to create a new project, how to rename your polygons, create new layers, and just get you guys comfortable creating polygons, whether it's a sphere or a cube or whatever you're working with, and then manipulating it from there. And there's going to be so many other ways that we can manipulate these objects that we're going to talk about in the rest of the series. So today, if you're leaving this tutorial just feeling comfortable moving your camera around the screen, going into face mode, vertex mode, edge mode, messing with the rotation and the scale, that sort of thing, we're at a good spot. So get comfortable with that. That's going to be the most important thing for me to have you guys, is to just be comfortable moving your camera around the screen. So play with that, create objects, just manipulate them for no reason at all, just so you're starting to get comfortable with the hotkeys, with some of the buttons. And then throughout the rest of the series, we're going to look at some other kind of basic modeling tutorials in Maya. So we're going to talk about different ways that we can manipulate our objects so that we can add detail into them, so that we can mirror them from side to side. And then we're going to talk about adding textures on as well. So we'll look at what's called laying on a UV map, which is really just an onion skin that wraps around your objects. You can then apply any type of texture or color to it, so that, you know, when you actually were to render out a finished image, it would look better than just kind of this standard gray that we see here. So there's going to be a lot to cover throughout the series, and the hope is to just create these kind of mini tutorials for you guys, so that you can just kind of load them up, get some quick notes from them, and then continue to work on your own projects in Maya. So I will be uploading these kind of throughout the next couple of weeks. So if you have any questions or have any tutorials in particular that you would request, please let me know. And you can just leave me a comment and let me know that. But from there, I hope that you enjoy that. I hope that you're starting to get comfortable in Maya, just moving your camera around, just creating some basic objects. And we will talk about how to have some more fun in here soon.